I got a handful of movie tropes that are kind of my favorite thing. I mean, they're not really my favorite thing. I just like to watch for them when they happen. And one is when somebody catches on fire, they always inevitably do the opposite of what we were taught in third grade, which is stop, drop, and roll. And instead they flail around and wave their arms. It's very comical. Another one of my favorite tropes is whenever somebody steals a moped or a car that's parked out in front of somewhere because they have to have a police chase right now. The person always inevitably runs out and shakes their fingers like, hey, come back here, to a car that's a block away and speeding. I hate to break it to you, they're probably not coming back. And another movie trope I like is the one where anybody does anything out of the ordinary and some lady or some guy who look very common emerge from what they were doing and shout, hey, you can't do that. And that is exactly what we get in Matthew chapter 12 from the Pharisees. You got some disciples who are walking with Jesus, and as they're going along, they exercise their ancient legal right established in all sorts of different ancient Near Eastern legal codes, reaffirmed in Roman law, and certainly affirmed in the Old Testament biblically. And that right that they're exercising is the one to walk through these fields and not harvest, but to pick off a little bit of the food, to mush it up in their hands, whatever, and grab a quick bite to eat along the way. In even recent times, I've heard accounts from people saying that people still do this. The expectation is that as long as you're not harvesting, it's just a way that hospitality lingers and manifests from time long lost in this part of the world. But in the Old Testament, I mean, you really do have smoking gun specific references to this practice going on and to it being allowed. Specifically, Deuteronomy 23, starting in verse 24. If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but don't put any in your basket. It's kind of like a hoo-hot Mongolian grill. You get as many trips as you want to the wok, but you can't take anything home with you in the box. Verse 25, if you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. So there are clear boundaries here in place. And on top of that, you got one of the beloved stories of the entire Old Testament in Ruth, where in chapter 2, we get all the details about how she's allowed to go behind the workers and glean. And the foreman, Boaz, even comes around and is like, hey, you are totally allowed to do that. So there's no accusation here in Matthew chapter 12 when the Pharisees come running up to Jesus and his disciples and say, hey, you can't do that. There's no accusation here that they're stealing or that theft is at issue. Rather, the issue is the Sabbath. And that comes through in their accusation very clearly. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Now, this accusation is coming at a moment of ratcheting tension in the narrative, as we've discussed. You can tell, not that Jesus' nerves are frayed, but there is a friction here that is emerging, and that friction is starting to gain traction in chapter 12. So if in chapter 12 we were actually in chapter 1, and this is the very first thing that happened in the narrative, and we got no history here, no context, and just there's a man, and he's walking with 12 other dudes, and they're in a field, and they eat some stuff, and some weirdos come up out of nowhere and like, hey, you can't do that. Well, then we don't really know what we're getting, and we can't appreciate why Jesus responds so firmly. If this were the first thing that happened in the book of Matthew, Jesus might actually look like kind of a jerk here for absolutely destroying the relatively aggressive idea ball serve that the Pharisees just put in play. But because this is happening in context, because we do get a sense of where Jesus is at and where the Pharisees are at, we better understand why Jesus so thoroughly takes apart their argument. He answered, as we looked at yesterday, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests, as we discussed yesterday. Argument number 1 here is that Christ is greater than David. The Pharisees would agree David was pretty awesome, but in Jesus implicitly claiming to be the Messiah, he's saying, like, I'm the new and greater David. I'm the completion of the story of the David. I am the bump bump to the bump da 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 of the original David story. And so if David had the authority to do this, how much more so would the Messiah, the son of David, the descendant of David, who will reign on the throne forever, have the authority to just go and eat some stuff regardless of what day it is? The second part of Jesus' relentless smashing back of the idea ball is in verse 5. Again, we glanced at this yesterday. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day, and yet they're innocent? Well, what Jesus is pointing out here is that the oral law of the Pharisees is actually in conflict and would make sinners out of the priests according to the actual written law of the Old Testament. So point number 2 in Jesus' response is there is hypocrisy in the bonus rules that you guys have made. Point number 3 in Jesus' response, or kind of rounding the corner into the conclusions of the first 2 points, depending on how you want to look at it, is in verse 6. He says, I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Okay, a couple quick things to break down. 1, he's saying, I tell you that one that's greater than the temple is here. That language about the temple really makes people angry. To you and me, we're like, a temple, I don't know, it got torn down anyway. Like, why is that such a big deal? The temple represented in the mind of the original audience and the Pharisees the place not only where God lived, but also the place where the law now lived. And what Jesus is saying pretty overtly, but with the rhetorical flourish here, is that his authority, his understanding of the Sabbath issue and the Sabbath controversies is greater than all of the sum of all of the debates that would be associated with the temple culture that had existed in this second temple area starting in the 530s BC and ending a little after this time of Jesus in 70 AD. But the second half of this third point has Jesus saying, if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the innocent. And this is actually the second time that Jesus has quoted Hosea 6:6. And Hosea, wow, what a story. I remember this is the one where God had a guy marry basically a prostitute, and then she leaves him and goes back into sex slavery, and then God's like, go get her back, Hosea. And then he does, and the whole thing is illustrating the heart of God toward the wandering people of Israel in some pretty graphic terms. And so Jesus now has quoted from that book that is a book that both simultaneously points out the glorious patience and forgiveness and long-sufferingness of God, but also the shame and embarrassment of Israel. And Jesus has quoted this thing twice. Remember, Matthew 9:13 has the same stuff. This is right after Jesus goes and talks with Matthew the tax collector. Matthew throws a great big party. The Pharisees, same exact guys. I mean, literally the same people were griping there that are griping here in the passage we're looking at over the grain and stuff on the Sabbath. And they're like, wow, why did your teacher hang out with tax collectors and sinners? And on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners. Once again, Hosea 6:6, exact same thing that he quotes to the exact same people just here 3 chapters later. And so implicit in the point here is Jesus is kind of saying, remember before, we've been over this, the whole thing about God desiring mercy, not sacrifice. Remember when you didn't get it the other day? Well, you're still not getting it now. Because if you did understand what that meant, you wouldn't be getting after my disciples right now, just like you were hassling my disciples when we're trying to meet with people that you guys won't touch and are content to just wash your hands of and write off. What Jesus was saying is you guys' priorities are screwed up. Your extra law and your temple culture has got you so backwards that you're doing the exact opposite of God's stuff, of kingdom stuff when it comes to people who have problems. And what he's saying here is nothing has really changed or improved in 3 chapters. You guys are still missing the point. Your priorities are still backwards, and that's causing you to accuse innocent people. Then point 4 of Jesus' argument is, and here's why I have the authority to say that. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, you will run into an interpretation of this passage from time to time that suggests that Son of Man here is better understood not in the Daniel way that we've looked at or the Ezekiel way that we've looked at, as a slightly more subtle nod to the notion of Jesus being Messiah than maybe the more overt Son of God. But some people will argue that here the phrase Son of Man is just referring to man, and that it shouldn't be capitalized like you see it in your Bibles, but it's just saying that the Sabbath is ruled over by men. I don't read it that way, though I have to admit that some of the people who are making the case for the Son of Man just means man thing, they got way better credentials than me. They're way better at the original language. If I understand correctly, the original language would have been ambiguous on this point because all of that Greek would have been written in capital letters, so you wouldn't know exactly how Matthew intended the phrase to be understood just grammatically. You'd have to use literary context to figure it out. But it's exactly because of that literal context that I think Jesus more likely means Son of Man in that messiahship context here. And that flow of argument falls flat unless there's a reminder of the claim to authority that punctuates the whole thing at the very end. So in terms of flow of logic, it makes a lot more sense to me. And in terms of the larger literary context of all of this ratcheting tension section of Matthew, it makes a lot more sense That what he means here is that claim to messiahship. And if Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah and should be regarded that way, then all of the debate and hubbub and rabbinical discourse that comes with the temple culture is moot, because God's chosen one, the suffering servant, the King of Kings, is here, and he has the authority as the fulfiller of the law, the completer of the law, to say, let me just settle the argument. It actually means this, and this is what we're going to do. And the text holds it out as that being exactly what Jesus just finished. And because we are at the very back end of our time here, we are going to pick that up tomorrow and work through the question of whether this has any implication for what we do with the Sabbath today, and also get on to the next passage. Oh, it's my friend Bob Claggett. I got to go grab that. Talk to y'all later. I'm Matt. This is 10 Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon. Hey, buddy, what's up?